Lakota Nations, and the home of the Métis people. My name is Melissa Shaw, and I'm the General Manager of Cultural and Aquatic Services with the city. Just a few housekeeping items. Our washrooms are located just through our gift store at the back. And if you need a drink or a refill, please, by all means, go visit Crystal. Before we get too far in, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank our sponsors, the City of Swift Current, Saskatchewan Lotteries, and SAS Culture for their continued support of our museum. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from Hugh Henry on the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the signing of Treaty 4. A former museum director and esteemed historian, Hugh brings a wealth of knowledge on a variety of subjects. We are thrilled to have us join him today on this special discussion. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hugh.
Thanks, Melissa. Treaty number 4 is a big topic, and the reason I kind of got interested in it a little bit is because when we gather as a group like this, it has been traditional for some time to have a treaty, a land acknowledgement, and I thought that's one aspect of understanding this 150th anniversary, which is coming up in September, but also terms like treaty land entitlement, which you may have heard, or we are all treaty people. So perhaps my presentation today will help us understand that whole concept of where we are at and why we have to be respectful for others who are here as well. And we'll have some questions at the end if you have any. I also want to, oh, there we go.
There we go, that's a little better.
I was wondering if I had to raise my voice or not. Just to let you know too that the sources of my information are internet or books. And I fully appreciate First Nations tradition of oral histories. And I want to acknowledge that I did utilize this book in some of my research as well, which is Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan. So it was done a number of years ago, interviewing elders around the province and different treaty territories, not just Treaty number 4, but it provides an oral understanding of what the treaty obligations were, what the treaty understandings were. So just want to acknowledge that. And also, I'm going to be listing a number of First Nations and chiefs as well. And I've used the spelling that is what I've considered the most commonly used today, and even being used by First Nations themselves. So there is some anglicized versions of those, and I'll maybe mention those as we go along as well, just to keep clear on that. And also to say that I didn't actually have any permission from any First Nations to actually talk about this topic, but again, I'm referring to some of their history, our combined history, so hopefully that's okay in everyone's eyes. Okay, the image on there I'll talk about later on during the program. That's just what's called the Pasqua pictograph, and it was, well, I'll tell you what it's about later on. Important document though. Okay, some pre-1874 history. Just a bit of an understanding of the reason that treaties were made and the whole concept of Canada. And so we're going back to this map here, and we all know 1867 was when Canada was founded. Basically the pinkish red area to the east, as you know, and subsequent to that, other provinces joined, British Columbia, etc., Manitoba as it was at that time. And even Prince Edward Island wasn't one of the initial ones that came on later on. And I'll make reference to Prince Edward Island as well. It's kind of an interesting little bit of history there. But the big changeover was when Canada acquired Rupert's Land, which was the territory of the Hudson Bay Company. And that was, of course, all the water that drained into Hudson Bay was considered Rupert's Land. And it was somewhat under the authority of the Hudson Bay Company, granted that access and use of that land by the Queen or King royalty back in England. And you'll see the different dates there too, when different parts of Canada kind of joined in. Just a bit about the Rupert's Land purchase. Some of you may know this, that it was purchased for 300,000 pounds, British pounds, which at that time the equivalent was about $1.5 million. But there's more to that, in that they were also given land around all of their trading posts, Most of the trading posts, of course, were in the northern part of, prairies and other parts of Canada, but there, of course, there was some on the prairies as well. And that was a bit of a sticking point with the treaty negotiations, which I'll mention. And those of you who know the settlement history, homestead history of Western Canada, every township has two, well, not always two, Hudson Bay sections, okay, Section 8 and Section 26, I think, because part of the deal, not just the payment, but they were given 1/20th of what was considered to be the fertile belt. They didn't know what the land was in Western Canada yet, but they were granted 1/20th of that as part of the payment, and they were able to acquire that and sell that within a 50-year period. So that brings us up to 1924. So they had a lot of time to be making a lot of money by selling off this land grant in Western Canada. And that also plays into some of the concerns that they had. Okay, here's a bit of a provocative little title there. How do we consider ourselves as conquerors or colonizers? And of course, we can think of the conqueror aspect maybe more in Latin America, South America, when you had Spanish and Portuguese and so on, that part of the country. Whether United States was a bit of both, and whether Canada becomes a good guy. But I think if you talk to a lot of First Nations, there is a lot of conqueror mentality, at least in terms of what happened in Canada with the immigration and settlement across Canada. The Royal Proclamation, this goes back to your high school history. That was the end of the 7 Years' War when Britain was fighting with France, and the Royal Proclamation was proclaimed. After that war was ended, and what it did is the British Crown said that they would not, when they came into contact with First Nations, that they would negotiate any kind of a transfer or any kind of engagement with them, that they would not be conquerors, they would be colonizers in a nice term. So the understanding was that they would be consulting in all the land acquisition that took place. And this is kind of interesting as well, and this speaks a bit to the First Nations perspective on things. Like when the Hudson Bay Company had all their forts and trading posts across Canada, there was no thought that they owned that land. They were there because the First Nations allowed that to happen. It was mutually beneficial because the fur trade helped both sides. So there was no transfer of ownership of land with all the Hudson Bay and other fur companies that were in Western Canada. So that's important to keep that in mind. Let's look at the treaty maps, or the numbered treaties in Western Canada a bit more. Just a bit of a background there. You see, we're talking about Treaty 4 today, but there were subsequent treaties and previous treaties, I should say. And what the government had in mind was actually to sign the land west of Lake Superior, so Northern Ontario as it stands today, and in Manitoba as it stands today. So they had in their mind that the Treaty 1, 2, 3, those three would be signed all together in 1871. Well, the Anishinaabe in Northern Ontario says, well, we're not quite liking your terms. So they were stalling for better terms. Part of it was how much land would be granted to individual families, resource extraction, mining and forestry and so on. And the government of Canada wasn't prepared to make some deals on that. So they didn't sign. So what the treaty negotiators, then they left them be, and they went on to southern Manitoba, and they were able to sign Treaty 1 and Treaty 2, both in 1871. And they tried again to negotiate in 1872, and finally got a settlement in 1873 with the Treaty 3 people. And those, they'd actually signed Treaty 1 and 2 with less land. They're granted a quarter section rather than a full section per family of 5. And so they got better land deal and also payments, annual payments that I'll talk about in a second as well. So they really upped the game a bit in terms of standing up to Canada. Subsequently, in 1875, those lesser terms that were negotiated 1 and 2 were actually upgraded then to everyone's on equal basis. But it's important then to note that then Treaty number 3 became the kind of the blueprint for subsequent treaties across Western Canada. Oh, okay, just focusing on the Treaty 4 territory there, you can see into present-day Alberta and all the way up to Lake Winnipegosis. A big territory there, and a number of different First Nations that live in those areas too. So, you think about some of the land transfer and farming and so on that we know about. What benefit was that to some of the places up against the, Lake Winnipegosis and so on. But that's a bit of a side issue there. And also, in terms of colonization, like that was always in the back of the mind. It may surprise you that we all know that there's Mennonites in southern Manitoba. They got there, the first group was in July and August of 1874. Even before Treaty 4 was signed, there was always this, the government was talking to people to come and immigrate. So that's a bit of a eye-opener there if you think about it. Okay, so who's the negotiators on behalf of Canada? Lieutenant Governor Morris, Alex Morris, who was Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba and the Northwest Territories. This is, David Laird, who was the government minister for Indigenous Affairs, as we'd call it today. Funny thing about him, he was from Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island just joined Confederation the year before, so here's a guy from Prince Edward Island, never been to Western Canada, probably had never, certainly never seen a Western Canadian First Nation. So he was actually supposed to be the main guy, but he had no experience, and so most of the negotiation was undertaken by Morris.
Could I ask a question? Did any of these people speak any of the languages of the native people?
Yeah, I'll get onto that in a second. And, excuse me, the next guy, William Christie, he was a Hudson Bay Company factor. He was retired. He spent his career 30 plus years in Saskatchewan, Alberta area, so he understood Cree and Anishinaabe, Saulteaux. So yes, he was there, but he was not the chief negotiator. They had, Mr. Dickinson was just a recording secretary of some of the deliberations, and Charles Pratt, who was a mixed Nakota Cree man who could speak both languages and who was a bit attached to the Anglican Church as well, so he had some training in the Anglican Church. So those are some of the key people in a sense. And then Morris wrote down some of his memories and understandings in this book here. You can see it's published in 1880, talking about his life. And Morris went on to negotiate Treaty Number 5, Treaty Number 6 as well. So he also negotiated Treaty Number 3, right, the precursor to Number 4. Now, this whole matter of understanding each other. Here's one of the chiefs at the negotiations. And just think about if he asked a question to Morris in these terms, and this is a translation of what he asked. Think about what is he asking, what is he understanding. Obviously, is it true that my child will not be troubled for what you're bringing him? He's looking into the future, right? It's not just what's happening today, but it's into the future. And what is the Queen's kindness? And they talked in those terms, and this is Morris's response to that: the Queen's power will be around him. Okay, so what does that power mean? Up to this point, and over many years, it was always the Queen's children. The Queen has red children, the Queen has black children, the Queen has white children. So they were talking about family here, right? And the Queen being almighty, the mother of all of us. So from the First Nations perspective, in my understanding of the reading, it's like we're all part of one family here. Like, you wouldn't do something against your brother or sister. It's all to everybody's good. What's going to happen is we're all going to agree that it's a good thing, and we're all going to be helping each other out to make it a good thing. So you have to, because you can't just translate directly from Cree or Saulteaux into English. It doesn't work that way. There's concepts, understandings of the world that are bigger than just those mere words on paper. And also, the treaties were actually drafted ahead of time. I said it was a blueprint. So what was written down on paper for Treaty Number 4, it was there. That's what they brought with us. Here's how much land we were prepared to give. here's the payments that are going to happen every year, here's what we're going to do to get you started farming and so on. So it was all written down. But there was a little bit of negotiation room because they didn't exactly know everything that they're going to get into. Plus, the federal government had a budget, and these guys were, Morris and Laird, they said, you got to stick to your budget with some slight flexibility, but they were under pressure too to take a hard line. Okay, so this is the initial signing of Treaty Number 4 at Fort Capel on September 15th. Previous to that, they had gathered about a week beforehand and talked about different issues. Getting back to what I said before, this came out after about 3 days because the First Nations was a fellow named, chief named the Gambler, is his English name. He was mad about something and they couldn't quite figure out what he was mad about. But what he was mad about, after about 3 days, is the fact that Laird and Morris and these guys from down east were in Fort Capel. Kind of nice digs, like they're in the fort and they got nice beds and so on. And this whole thing about the Hudson Bay Company, they knew that the Hudson Bay Company got paid £300,000. And no one asked them if it was for sale or what the price should be. And so they were kind of mad at the Hudson Bay Company. And yet Morris, on behalf of the government, would say, well, they have nothing to do with us. That was kind of a deal aside, has nothing to do with today. But they were insistent, well, it does have something to do today. You're sitting in their fort. Your 200 militiamen that came with you are on that land. And I mentioned that they got granted land around the fort. So they wanted all the negotiations to happen where it's nice and comfortable. And then the First Nations insisted, no, we're not going to come there. That's not, that's not good land. That's not a good place to negotiate and make any kind of headway. So finally, Morris did agree to come sort of meet them halfway because there was about 2,000 First Nations people apparently in that area, so they met them halfway. So they came off of the already surveyed land around Fort Capel, and that's when negotiations started going. And they had also, this is another bit here, because we're talking about Cree and Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, they knew what happened further east, the agreements that were made, and also there were other agreements that were made after those Treaty Number 3 was signed, and Treaty Number 2 and Number 1. There was what was on paper, but there were discussions that said other things would be granted to you outside of what was on the paper, and these are termed outside promises. So outside promises were made, but they weren't recognized by the federal government until 1875, so a year after this. So the Saulteaux knew that there were these outstanding grievances further to the east, and they wanted, that dealt with as well, making sure that they weren't going to get a bad deal as well. Okay, just a bit on the screen there. I've underlined some of the names there. Those are bands that were in either Cypress Hills or what was termed at the time south of the South Saskatchewan River. Okay, so that's some of them there. The other ones would be more the Yorkton area, further north. And you see here a combination of First Nations names, plus some that are anglicized. And you have a name like Gordon, George Gordon First Nations. Well, that was given to them after either a religious figure or a government agent or whatever. They became known as Gordon's Band. But they would have, originally had the First Nations names on them. But again, these are the ones that, the spellings and the names are ones that are used commonly today. Okay, so what was they agreeing upon? These are the main ones. So every family of 5 was granted a square mile of land, annual payments. The chiefs were granted $25, the headmen or the band counselors, $15, and every other person, man, woman, child, was $5 per year. Every reservist to get a school, and we know how that kind of went south. And there was no alcohol would be permitted. The farming is a big thing too. The term actually cultivating, they would be given materials to farm if they're actually cultivating, which is kind of a catch-22 there. So tools were, every family got 2 hoes, a spade, a scythe. Every 10 families got a plow, every plow for 10 families. there was a team of oxen for every band, and a bull and 4 cows for every band, and a set of carpentry tools, saws and chisels, whatever, per band. So they're somehow supposed to, transfer from bison chasing and bison eating and bison economy into a farming economy. But anyways, the understanding, here's what comes into problems later and subsequently years, even in today. What does that mean? Like a one-time only thing, or do you sort of have some leeway there to understand that things are changing and understanding that you can't live on, you can't be cultivating today with a spade and a hoe and a plow. Okay, and other provisions were hunting, fishing, trapping. They were granted what they had up to this point, except for whatever the government deemed was necessary for their purposes. And of course, one of those purposes was settlement, but it could be for forestry, it could be for mining, it could be for other things as well. And another provision is the surrender of lands. So there was a provision there that if they wanted to, First Nations could surrender portions of their reserve, but it had to be with consent. And that's a whole other problem area, which I'll get to shortly here. This goes back to what I was sort of saying before, if you read that. And I've underlined the last part there for emphasis. So these are what those outside promises are. So there were conversations happening all during the day and so on, and agreements and understandings. And so what Morris is saying here is, well, we know what was decided, and we'll write it down afterwards. And if the First Nations don't think it's right, well, we've got the record in our back pocket. Of course, the First Nations never treaty record from a First Nations perspective. There's a bit of a story with that as well, which I won't get into because it's quite lengthy, but there was a fellow from Britain who was visiting the Quebec Valley a few years after, early 1880s, and well, we know the Queen lives in Britain, you're from Britain, how about if you take this back to Britain and show the Queen what we agreed upon? Now, this was repatriated back in 2007 to Canada. There was a fundraising effort to get this. It went up for auction. Some of you may remember that, and there were donations being taken for that. So it resides at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum in Regina, and the elders come in and they interpret it as they will and is appropriate. And from what my understanding is, on the left-hand side there, those are Pasqua's understanding of what was agreed upon at the signing of the treaty. And the right-hand side is a yearly calendar about what was delivered on those promises. So starting from the top there, so 74, 75, up to 83 or so. I think the math adds up there. So that was his record of what was promised, what was delivered, and then this guy was supposed to take us back to the Queen and, straighten things out a bit. Okay, so I said there was initial signing and then there were subsequent signings. So later, on the way back down east, they stopped at Fort Ellis, which is kind of on the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border today. And there's 2 bands that were Manitoba-based that were signed the treaty there. The following years, when treaty payments, the annual payments, they gathered for that at Fort Capel. And you see Piebot and Muscatine were there from the Cypress Hills area. The last 3 there, White Bear, Pheasant Rump, and Ocean Man, they were actually part of that's the Moose Mountain area, and they were actually part of the Treaty 2 territory, but they never signed Treaty 2, so they signed on to Treaty 4 that following year. And a little bit further north, Fort Pelly, Shoal Lake area, then there's a couple of more bands or chiefs signed up there. And then the next year, and then finally in Fort Walsh, Carry the Kettle, which maybe you've heard before. And the reason I got the asterisk there is because you may have heard that Chief Nicodeet never signed treaty, which is true. But there are records that he took treaty payments, him and his followers took treaty payments at Fort Walsh for a couple of years after Treaty 4 was signed. And then also at the bottom there, Grizzly Bear's Head, Lean Man, Carrying the Kettle was Nakota as well, so the last 3 are Nakota. They actually were from the Cypress Hills, but they were moved up into the Battleford area, and they actually signed Treaty Number 6 of Battleford. I should also mention as well, Carry the Kettle, he was granted a reserve at what's called Head of the Mountain, which is the Alberta side of the Cypress Hills. He was actually a surveyed reserve there, and they thought that they could stay there, but the government rescinded that and took that back a number of years later because they didn't want anybody in that area. So here's kind of what it looks like today. Again, you can see Niconete by itself, Wood Mountain, another story there because of course they're Dakota. And then you see down in the bottom right-hand side, Ocean Man, White Bear, and Pheasant Mountain. So those again, treaty number 4. But that's sort of showed you where the dispersions took place, or where the reserves are today. And you see at the very top there, you can see Grizzly Bear's Head, Lean Man. Just a little bit of a note there, I think it was last fall, was that Whitecap Dakota signed treaty. They were Dakota groups, they never signed treaty either. So they were granted treaty governance with the federal government last fall, I think it was, or last summer. And also, just again, a bit of an anomaly, Standing Buffalo, northeast of Regina. They were also a Dakota band, but they did not sign treaty, but they were granted a reserve later on. Okay, here's a book that came out last fall. Maybe some of you had a chance to read it, I'm not too sure. The name Bill Wazer will be familiar to a lot of you, but the title explains itself there. This refers to the surrender of lands. So there's a lot of shady dealings by the government and other people in terms of coercing First Nations into selling part of the reserve land. Mostly it was for settlement purposes, and they were flipping the land and making a profit. And of course, the whole thing as well, you're not using it appropriately. We've got people who can farm better than you, or you're just leaving it to bush, so sell it. There's a whole, if you read this book, Wazer kind of outlines a lot of the different reasons for surrenders. And the funny part about it as well is that the protocol for all these land surrenders were written into the Indian Act, which was written in 1876, 2 years later than after Treaty Number 4. So land surrenders are part of the agreement, but the particulars of that surrender weren't ironed out, or weren't kind of brought on by the federal government and imposed by the federal government. So anyways, Bill Wazer talks about surrenders in Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan. Very interesting. I'll point some of those out as well in just a second. Wow. That's just a sample. You can see from 1901 up to 1909, just a sample of some of them. Some of the regulations have already been mentioned in terms of the surrender. If the land was sold, the First Nation got 10% of the land. The government kept 10% as a seller's fee, and the rest of it was held in account that they would be given to First Nations when it was deemed by the federal government to, be worthwhile expenditure. But another part of the problem is there's a lot of, like I said, shady dealing and so on. So you get the land companies who will be bidding on some of these properties, and they, in a sense, would be the buyer, but they never always paid up. And the First Nations never got their 10% until the government got their full amount for the land. So there could be 10, 12 more years before they got all that going to court and trying to find the paper trail of who's actually buying what. And here they are sitting less land and no money. And of course the 10%, that was just basically to food, clothing, all bit of agricultural stuff that helping them survive. And quite often sold before below market value. Okay, there's quite a bit more about that, and like I said, Bill Wazer's book. Okay, I want to just note the top 3 there. The Cote Band, they've surrendered land for where Kamsack is today, because they really wanted to go right through there, so they wanted a town site. So where Kamsack is today is part of Cote's surrendered land, as well as railway on either side. Carry the Kettle we'll look at a little bit later on. And Ocean Man and Pheasant Rump, you see they surrendered all of theirs in 1901. So I'll just pick up on that story a bit. This is a bit hard to digest here, but this is a 1882 map. On the far left side, you can see Moose Jaw Creek there. That's as far as the railway track goes. You can follow the railway track there, a bit heavier line. Pile of bones, no Regina quite yet. So the pink area is fully surveyed lands. The squares, of course, are townships, so 36 sections of township. So you can see by the spacing of the lines there, surveying was just kind of get going there. You do see in the bottom right-hand corner is the three bands I mentioned in the Moose Mountain area. Notice how, okay, so the one on the left there is the Pheasant Rump. Help me out here. And Ocean Man band, Pheasant Rump and Ocean Man. Now they were both Nakota bands, and White Bear was a Cree band on the other side of the mountains there. So they were swindled out of their land basically, and they were told to go over and be on the same reserve as White Bear. So you got two different cultural aspects. Not that they're necessarily enemies, but you got half the land base basically. Everybody's farming. So anyways, they were obliged to go over there. They weren't given any help getting over there and put all their equipment and all their belongings and so on. So they had to settle in with the White Bear band. And you see the other hatch marked up close to the Qu'Appelle Valley too. So you can see some of the other reserves that we looked at before. But part of something I neglected to mention, the treaty was signed in 1874. Some of these reserves, most of them, were not surveyed until 1880 or 1881, as much as 7 or 8 years later. So what's happening to all these bands who are starving, can't farm yet because we don't have a reserve to farm, don't have the implements and everything else. So the part of the pressure then to have them sign it in the first place was the fact that they were starving. There was a smallpox outbreak in 1870 that took up to a third of the First Nations population. So they were struggling, and so in a sense, we always think about the treaties being imposed on First Nations. Well, they were actually asking and demanding, even in Southern Alberta, Treaty Number 7, it was 7 or 8 years that they were asking for a treaty. And the government's plan was, well, we'll deal with it when we need it. When we need that land for settlement, we need that land for forestry, whatever, we'll deal with it then. So they were, being, in a sense, pressured into making deals as well. Okay, so we down at Ocean Man and Pheasant Rump. Okay, so this is a year after. Okay, they surrendered the land in 1901 over at the White Bear. Here's just a receipt from Carlisle, one of the merchants straight south to White Bear, and I'll read what it says. It's kind of hard. Okay, this is the fellow asking for something. His name is Standing White Man. He's sugar and tobacco for $1, Stroud, which is wool broadcloth, a coat for $6.25, and print, obviously fabric, for 75 cents. And then it says here, I acknowledge that the above account is correct. I hereby authorize the Indian Department to pay it out, the bonus coming to me under terms of surrender of reserves in March 1901. And then his X at the bottom there. Another sample, basically the same thing, acknowledged and so on. And this fellow's name is Nashota. And what he's asking for is harness. So it's not, he's making a living. It's not sort of wasting money. It's something that he needs. So again, going back to the treaties was, what was promised in terms of tools for farming didn't really make sense in terms of what was needed to have people farm successfully. Here's a Carry the Kettle band, 1900, 1901. Looking pretty good with their harvesting there. Thanks for Alex McPhee. You may recognize if anybody's bought one of his maps or not. This is from Alex McPhee's map. which is very conveniently shows where surrendered land is. And you can see there's 9 sections in the bottom of the reserve that they've surrendered due to pressure for farming. But they wanted their money because they wanted a threshing machine. So this is 4 or 5 years since that photograph was taken. So they're threshing all that by hand. They needed a threshing machine. And also they had some fencing done, so part of their money was to go to pay off their bill for fencing part of the reserve.
Guess they wanted to eat.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move up ahead a little bit. What was sort of happening? So things were kind of muddy for a lot of years, a lot of decades. In the Constitution Act, most of you remember that, repatriating the Constitution, and that also is the basis for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And in Section 35 there you can see that the government, hopefully and sincerely wanting to move ahead on Indigenous relations. And again, that's when First Nations were recognized as a founding group, and Inuit and the Métis, they're all spelled out and all designated as Aboriginal people. A little later on, in terms of Saskatchewan, there's an act to get some of the reserve land back in where it belonged. And there was something earlier on there, some of you may know this, the Natural Resources Transfer Agreement. That's when the federal government transferred operation and governance of the natural resources to the provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan. So that caused problems because the treaty was signed with First Nations and the federal government, included hunting, fishing, resource use. Well, now that's all into the purview of the provincial government, and so they got to sort of figure out, how much authority they want to hang on to and how much they want to give up. So that complicates things as well. But I just thought I'd throw that in there because it's a sticking point even up into today. And then a Settlements Implementation Act 2002, it just helps speed along the process in terms of some of the, undelivered promises. Oh, I should mention the Treaty Land Entitlement Act. I just got some notes here. That's where you may have heard the term willing seller, willing buyer. So if there's Crown land that was available for sale, and then First Nations could use that, but they could, any individual farmer could also sell land for this Treaty Land Entitlement. So it could be Crown land, but it could also be private land. And since that time, my notes have 33 agreements have been signed in terms of, and 886,000 acres. And a value of $595 million, 70% of it funded by the federal government, 30% by the province. Okay, let's get back to Carry the Kettle. So part of their treaty land entitlement, they got some land close by, and they were one of the bands that on the original treaty were designated as being south of the South Saskatchewan River. So this is probably traditional territory for them. Not the best farmland there, but there's some natural gas reserves, which may have been part of their reason for going there too. Okay, even to speed things up further, the Tribunal, the Ministry of Crown and Indigenous Relations, and you can see there the quote from the. So this is an opportunity for bands right across Canada, not just Treaty Number 4, to settle outstanding grievances. And there's a maximum of $150 million that can be paid out to settle the agreements. So it's for smaller claims, but it's going to speed up the process. You can see there how many are active in Saskatchewan and in Canada. So once the First Nation submits its claim, the federal government has 3 years to accept it, saying it's a legitimate claim, and then we'll look at it, and everything's done by arbitration. So the bands have their lawyers, government has their lawyers, and they look at what's the value of the land increasing over time, all those farming, lack of farming supports that happened all those years, what's the value of that going up into the future. So it can get quite complicated, and there's different aspects. The one about the farming is, this is the kind of the slogan that uses cows and cows. That's a term that's quite generally used in terms of negotiation. That's what we're referring to. what was really meant by all that agricultural support back then. And again, just some samples. If a railway was going through there, Basco, they weren't compensated for the land taken for railway. Wood Mountain just settled recently as well for land taken from them. I just want to make a note of Papicasis there. That land was taken from them to start up a colony in that area, in the Corral Valley. So they weren't even authorized to give up the land, but it was taken for farming purposes. So they actually had 36 years that they were fighting the government to get that amount of land back. A farming colony, a better term. Okay, just speeding up to, so what's kind of the picture today? Well, they're very progressive. Many bands are very progressive, getting into a lot of different areas for economic development. Mosquito, Grizzly Bears, Head, Lean Man, economic development corporations. A lot of First Nations have economic development corporations and investing money in, urban reserves and casinos and so on. It's quite varied. Okay, getting sort of closing out here. Just going back to Alexander Morris, where we kind of started there. And I've underlined words there, which if you just give them a bit of emphasis. Practical importance. Well, there's a practical importance both from the government's point of view, but from the First Nations point of view. The treaty was signed for practical purposes, like just not the government, but it was really meant to be a new window on life. Alliance with them. Okay, that goes back to the partnership. Are we all part of the same family? And integrity, obligations. Again, and this is from the book I showed you, Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan. And that last few words are never to be put away. So that's the understanding of we're all treaty people. Okay, it's not a final thing that was signed one time and then that's all, it's gone. But it's kind of like a marriage, you got the good and the bad, but you got to keep on pushing ahead together, and you never, put it aside, put it away. And the last one there is just the Treaty 4 gathering ground at Fort Capel. I don't know if any of you have ever been out there, but they'll be having a week-long gathering there this September. And a lot of the bands, of course, on that area that signed Treaty Number 4, and for further away as well, will be represented there. So that's what I have for you. Don't know if I can answer any questions, but I'll try.
Now, Hugh, with the original settlement, each band was allotted one set of oxen and one plow.
Yes. No, pardon me. A plow for every 10 families, one oxen, a set of oxen, a bull, and 4 cows for the whole band to share. Something else, I thought you were going to ask this question. Now, when they signed the treaties, they enumerated how many people were from each one of the bands. I mentioned before about, well, you signed in 74, you didn't get your reserve to 81, 82. Well, a lot of people died, a lot of people moved on. They might have amalgamated into different other bands. So that's part of the problem with this treaty land entitlement. The numbers declined from 74 till 80 or 81 or 82. And that's why when they finally surveyed the reserves, well, what's your numbers? We'll count. Well, that's not what they signed on. They signed on a higher number. And that's part of the treaty land entitlement, is getting that land back that was never part of the reserve in the first place. And something else about the reserves too. You can see from the government point of view, well, we'll get them over the reserve and they'll stay there. From the First Nations point of view, from what I read, it's like, okay, the white man's not going to come here. We've got this far all by ourselves. It's kind of like a different mentality. Like they may be out there, but they're going to leave us alone when we're on a reserve. So it's kind of a different way of looking at even the whole idea of a reserve.
I have to say something
Sure.
about the cows and plows. I just want you guys to understand something about the cows and plows. I'm from Beardy's, Okamasis Reserve. Our band is in negotiations right now for cows and plows. And it's because of the treaties that were not completed. And a lot of the First Nations farmers and people on Beardy's, Okamasis never got that settlement. So they never got the properties that they were promised in the treaties. So a lot of these treaties are still in negotiation. This is going on 3 years now for Beardy's to complete the cows and plows, but they're trying to estimate how much per person on the reserve. There's about 3,000 people in Beardy's. So if you estimate those costs and try and take that to the federal government, there's a lot of negotiations going on, because one of the things about those treaties is they have to be straightened out, and they have to be looked at through that lens of the treaties that they signed a long time ago per person, right? So it's a very in-depth look of cows and plows. You hear it a lot on the news. And there's, like our band, I think it's going on the second year now, it's still in works. And some of the things too with the treaties, if they sign these cows and plows treaties, they might end up losing their treaties altogether just to get that money, you know? Like they might get a payout, but they might end up long-term history treaties that should be going on to keep their resources going. So it's kind of like a bittersweet pill, right? Like you're all probably getting money for it, but you're also going to give up something. So these are the kind of things that are in negotiations right now with cows and plows. So it's ongoing, and I just want you guys to understand that if they agree to this settlement, we might end up losing some of the treaty rights related to the resources in the location of the BRDs. So that's how some of that works. So if anybody has any questions, they can ask me. Thank you.
Hugh, I was kind of wondering, because it's such a different way of life from, you know, the colonial and agriculture of kind of overproduction to indigenous subsistence. And I was wondering, with the crop production, like they were trading for a threshing machine, were they pressured to be producing these crops instead of, like, were they trying to be subsistence when they got this land and the treaty signed, or were they pressured to become part of that kind of I don't know if I'm saying it well.
Well, they were adapting. They understood that they were adapting to a new way of life, that the buffalo days were over. The only option really, I mean, the hunting was sporadic or whatever. The only alternative presented to them was farming. And if you think back about them, what else is there? There's no tourism, there's no other business we think of today. So that they were obliged to do that. That's all they had to go to. They had the land base. They had supposedly the assistance from the government. But part of that, another catch-22 there as well, the more successful that you got with farming, well then the government, they paid, paid so much to support the First Nations annually anyways, above the actual treaty payment. So they were supporting the bands if there was hunger, starvation, some diseases, there's other levels of support that they provided. But if you were successful, well then we didn't need any support. You didn't need any foods, flour, sugar, whatever, from the federal government. You can, sell it yourself. And that's part of the problem as well. Of course, you have the passes and so on to get off the reserve, to sell your cattle, to sell your wheat and so on. You always had to have permission to do that. That came later on. But children, they accepted that challenge to learn how to farm, but were the supports there to make it a success for them and the family and the band itself. And that's where some of this cows and plows comes in. Those are, what was the expectation? A one-time spade, a one-time hoe, forever? I mean, you have to And the federal government is acknowledging that it's not reasonable to expect a cow and four cows and a bull to serve a whole needs of the whole band. You're holding them down. You're not giving them an opportunity to be successful. So part of the arguments then is, what's the value, what's the lost production, in a sense, of that land by not being able to farm it? And have these other, whether it's forestry, whether it's fishing, all those different aspects of commerce.
And when they did get successful at farming, wasn't there, I thought there was something where, now they're making too much money, we gotta bring another policy in to kind of cut it down or something.
Well, it could be, but I think what I said there was part of it, that, you don't need our help, and there was always, and there was things like work for food, if you worked off the reserve, whatever, you worked for you cut back on things because, you weren't getting a regular wage, you're just kind of working for your food, and so it was really, there's a lot of different, not very nice things that were happening, but it was, it was racist, and it was just sort of a imperialist attitude. Keep them back. Yes, Mary?
Is that only on reserve land or is that on crown land?
Well, see, the way treaty spelled it out, it was on, you're allowed to do it, keep on your livelihood as it was when you signed the treaty, except if the government needed it for other purposes. And so when the settlers came in, then, well, of course, that's their land now, so you're staying off of it. Or if the federal government had a forestry reserve, whatever, well, they've got that specified for some other reason. And that's where I mentioned before, this natural resource transfer to the provinces that really got in, muddied the waters when they had control of saying where you can hunt, where you can fish, where you can cut down trees.
The transfer agreement of 1930, there's one in Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
And all three contain a clause. In Saskatchewan, it's called Clause 12. It says the Indians of the province may hunt and fish on crown lands and lands to which they have the right of access. And rightly or wrongly, that's been the law in Saskatchewan since then. So in order to hunt and fish on lands, private lands, as we call them, the First Nations people would require permission.
Thank you.
And a license.
Yep.
You showed a slide where these bands had turned over a certain amount of acres from their original settlement.
Yep.
Has that been reduced since then, or do those bands still own that or have control over those acres that will remain?
I'm not quite sure, Lyle. They had the initial surveyed reserve, and then they surrendered lands. Their treaty land entitlement, they may be buying some of that back, but more likely, though, they're going to other parts of the province. Like if you look at a map around Cypress Hills, Carry the Kettle is buying land, back there too. So, okay, let's look here. So there's all these parcels outside the main reserve. They could be Carry the Kettle. They could be some of the other bands that are purchasing land in different areas. And even the Ocean Man and Pheasant Rump, I didn't put their modern map on here, but they're buying a lot of land back west of the Moose Mountain area, but just parcels here and there and so on. Because again, they surrendered their whole reserve as initially surveyed. So they have a lot of treaty land entitlement to get back. So how they're going about that, I'm not too sure. Again, it probably, willing seller, willing buyer arrangement. So if land comes up, then if they like the price or can pay the price, then that's how they'll get their land back, some land back.
A lot of the indigenous farmers too in our community, because they live at Fort Capalda, the river goes through the back there. They lease and rent farmland from people that are retired. So they have the option to buy it from the farmers, or else they have the option to rent it. So it works in their favor. The farmer's getting their money's worth for the years they put into their farm, but Indigenous people are learning how to farm and do self-government and creating more work for it. So there's like a really two good parts of it going on. You look at it both parts, you'll see that all these treaties are actually coming together slowly, and it all has to do with self-government, but part of their treaties is to be able to negotiate to buy land from non-Indigenous farmers. And lots of people are retired and they don't want to farm anymore, so they're rented out. They make an agreement just like you would at a lawyer's office and say, we want a certain percentage of the money from this land, but then you can farm on it too. It's really broad.
Mel?
Yeah, so Hugh, thinking of the original land allotments and the number of acres that were surrendered back here, there, whatnot, was there a time limit whereby they could do that? Thereby forcing, oh, if you want any money, you're gonna have to do with it, like putting pressure on in that sense? Or was it sort of wide open time frame wise?
Well, maybe because other people have a perspective on this, but I think a lot of it was based on a dollar value. So you might have been giving so many millions of dollars to purchase back however much land you lost. As far as I know, there's no time limit on that. As, you know, it's money in the bank for you to, you know, I guess purchase land and increase your land base as you see fit, as you see economic activity, as the band grows, perhaps. There might be multiple factors to, you know.
Yeah, like I'm thinking of, say you have to turn back within 25 years of treaty signing or whatever, if you want any money.
No.
That wasn't used at all, or?
No, you know, in terms of surrender, like it was, there was, in a sense, there was no, the First Nations were not wanting to surrender the land. It was mostly because they were pressured into it. Like even if you read Bill Waser's book there, like some of the dirty dealings, like the Indian Act spells out, okay, so you have to have a majority of band members agreeing to it. Well, of course, women didn't have a vote, so it was the men.
Probably, yeah, just the men.
Yeah, the men, but you know, but you have agreements on both sides. Some want to surrender, some don't. Well, let's just, if the vote is negative, well, we'll come back next week. And they come back next week with some gifts, you know, or they might come back when some of the guys that they know are against it are out hunting sometime. You know, they played that kind of game. And again, if you read Waser's book, he spells a lot of that out. Yeah, even like, and one of the examples is in Alberta, like south across the river in Edmonton, that was all reserve land as well. I forget the name of that subdivision there, but just south on the way to Calgary, that was all reserved. That was kind of swindled by a real estate guy who later became a politician. Yeah. So, I mean, the story is endless, but there's all these different tricks that they do to get the way they wanted it, you know.
Creative manipulation.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. If you have any other questions you want to approach me, I've got some more facts and figures up here if you want to check anything, but thanks for your attention. It's nice to have you.
Thank you, Hugh, for coming and helping us learn more about the signing of Treaty 4. And I feel like we could probably keep this conversation going for far longer than the hour. But as Hugh said, he'll stick around for a few minutes. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to come up and speak with them. Big thank you to the casino for supplying our lunch today. It sure smells and looks delicious. Our next Lunch and Learn will be on May 15th, where Pete LaRue will be coming to talk to us about a walk between two docks. He spent 46 days hiking the Great Divide Trail from Waterton to Kakawa Park, Provincial Park in Alberta, a total of 1,200 kilometers. Lunch that day will be a traditional trail lunch of rice and refried beans that you guys will help prepare for yourselves. So please feel free to stop and register at the front desk on your way out. Also, the Lyric will be hosting their Write Out Loud series this evening at the museum. They'll be joined by author Gail Smith and musical performance by Celia Hamilton. One last chance, closing this Thursday afternoon will be Iron-Willed Women in STEM. We'll be opening our next exhibit called Beyond Human Limits in early May. It is an action-packed ride through the world of extreme sports, a highly interactive exhibition developed and produced by Science North in partnership with the Ontario Science Centre, bringing visitors inside the minds and bodies of extreme athletes and explores the psychological and physiological motivations of the science of extreme sports. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.